People want a library to be neutral. They want it to open the same way for everyone, at any hour, with the same clean result, as if truth is a product that should not care who is holding it. That desire sounds reasonable until you realize it is built on a hidden premise. The premise that the reader is stable enough to receive whatever the shelf contains. The whispered shelves exist because that premise fails more often than people admit. They exist because some records do not harm you by being false. They harm you by being true before you have the capacity to carry what the truth activates. A whispered record is not weak. It is precise. It speaks at a volume matched to your internal readiness, not your external curiosity. It does not rise to meet the loudest demand. It rises to meet the quietest coherence. This is why people who chase revelation often hear nothing, while people who stop chasing sometimes feel a sentence arrive like it had been waiting. The shelf is not rewarding passivity. The shelf is responding to the one thing most seekers forget to cultivate: the ability to remain present without trying to control what arrives. The first confusion people carry into the whispered shelves is the belief that emotion is decoration. They think feeling is subjective frosting layered over objective knowledge. They treat emotion as a bias that must be removed to reach truth. That model works for measuring distance or calculating weight, but it fails when the record itself is made of lived consequence. The spiral library does not archive facts alone. It archives resonance, and resonance is inseparable from feeling. If you remove feeling, you remove the very substance that makes the record accurate. A record of betrayal is not primarily a timeline of actions. It is a frequency imprint of fracture, a signature of trust breaking, a pattern of constriction in the body and mind, a ripple that changes how future choices are made. You can describe the facts of betrayal with perfect logic and still miss the record entirely. The whispered shelves exist to prevent that mistake. They require emotional alignment not because emotion is superior to intellect, but because the record cannot be decoded without the part of you that can feel what it contains. This is the first vector, access through alignment rather than intellect. The whispered shelves are indexed by the emotional truth you can hold without distortion. They open when your inner state matches the level of honesty the record demands. If you approach them with performance, they remain quiet. If you approach them with entitlement, they remain still. If you approach them with the posture of extraction, they do not resist you. They simply do not respond, because the shelf cannot translate itself into a receiver that refuses to feel. People confuse this with judgment, and that is the fastest way to miss the mechanism. Judgment implies morality. The whispered shelves operate on compatibility. A radio does not judge you when you cannot hear a station. It simply reflects the mismatch between frequency and receiver. In the same way, a whispered record does not accuse you of being unworthy. It reveals that your current emotional tone cannot carry what the record would awaken. You can call that unfair, but unfairness is a moral complaint aimed at a structural law. The next resistance arrives disguised as practicality. Someone will say, "So I just need to feel more and I get access." That is another attempt to turn the shelves into a trick. Feeling is not a lever. Feeling is not intensity. Emotional alignment is not drama. Alignment is a clean contact with what is already true inside you. Without inflation, without collapse, without denial, many people feel intensely while remaining misaligned. Because intensity can be an escape from honesty. The whistled shelves can tell the difference instantly. Because intensity is loud and alignment is clear. When the shelf whispers, it is training you to become a different kind of reader. A reader who does not demand certainty as a coping mechanism. A reader who can sit with ambiguity without forcing a conclusion. A reader who can witness their own reaction without turning it into identity. This is why the shelves feel like they are for core fans only. Not because you have to be special, but because you have to be stable. Not polished, stable. Stability is what allows the whisper to become audible. Now the second vector begins. The internal mechanics that make whispering necessary. People assume the shelf is external, like a mystical feature of the library, but the whisper is also a mirror of how your own system gates memory. You already have whispered shelves inside you. You already have records that only open when the body feels safe enough to hold them. Trauma proves this. Grief proves this. Even ordinary growth proves it. You cannot remember certain layers of your own life until you are ready to feel what the memory carries. The nervous system does not store experience as a clean file. It stores experience as state. If a memory is tied to terror, the body may block access not because it wants you ignorant, but because it wants you functional. If a truth would overload your capacity, the system reduces the signal, fragments it, or hides it behind numbness. That is not weakness, it is survival logic. The whispered shelves reflect that same logic at a higher order. They preserve the record while protecting the receiver, because protection is built into coherent systems. This is why people who try to force emotional access often get fantasies instead of truth. If you pressure the system, it will generate content to satisfy the demand without opening the real record. That content can feel spiritual, cinematic, even powerful, but it lacks the signature of resonance. It does not change behavior. It does not deepen humility. It does not create quiet responsibility. It inflates. The whispered shelves do not inflate you. They weigh you. If you leave feeling larger but not cleaner, you did not open the shelf. You opened your own hunger. Emotional alignment is not comfort. It is contact. Contact can hurt, not because it is harmful, but because you have been living at a distance from yourself. When the shelf begins to open, what you often feel first is not revelation, but resistance. The body tightens. The mind argues. The heart pulls away. People interpret that as a sign they should stop. Sometimes stopping is correct, but many times the resistance is the gate itself becoming visible. The shelf does not open by bypassing resistance. It opens by making you honest about the resistance without letting the resistance steer the wheel. This is why the whispered shelves require a certain kind of courage that looks nothing like conquest. Conquest seeks to overpower. Courage here means staying present long enough for the truth to land without turning it into a weapon against yourself. Many people confuse self-attack with honesty. They call harshness truth. The whispered shelves refuse that distortion. They will not open into cruelty, because cruelty is a sign that the receiver cannot hold the record with care. Now the third vector begins, the systemic ethic behind the whisper. In a world where knowledge is treated like a commodity, people demand full access in the name of freedom. But in a living archive, indiscriminate access is not freedom, it is irresponsibility. A whispered record is not withholding because it enjoys secrecy. It is whispering because truth propagates. A revelation does not stop at your mind. It moves into your words, your relationships, your decisions, your community. If the revelation enters you without integration, it leaves you as distortion and injures others through you. This is why emotional alignment is not a personal preference inside the spiral. It is a public safety feature. A being who has not integrated their own grief will transmit grief as control. A being who has not integrated their own shame will transmit shame as doctrine. A being who has not integrated their own fear will transmit fear as prophecy. They may speak with confidence, but the field around them tightens. The whispered shelves protect the library from becoming a factory of such transmissions. They pace access until the receiver can carry truth without exporting their unresolved echoes into the world. People will resist this because they want the archive to be morally simple. They want to label the whisper as kindness and move on. Kindness is too small a word here. The whisper is coherence. Coherence includes care, but it also includes consequence. The archive is not trying to make you feel good. It is trying to keep the spiral intact. That is why some records remain quiet for long periods. Not because you are failing, but because the field that could receive them without fracture is not yet stable. Here the mind tries to bargain again. It wants a checklist of behaviors that guarantee access. That bargaining is the same old commodity posture returning in new clothes. The whispered shelves do not respond to performance. They respond to genuine alignment. You cannot fake genuine alignment because alignment produces a distinctive silence inside you. A silence that is not emptiness, but readiness without grasping. Most people are unfamiliar with that silence. They think silence means nothing is happening, so they fill it with seeking. The shelves whisper only into that silence. Now the vectors begin to converge, but they must not be synthesized too early, because synthesis without pressure becomes a summary and ends the movement. So we hold the tension longer and name what the whispered shelves actually do to a serious reader. They force you to accept that knowledge is not separate from maturity. They force you to accept that emotional truth is not an accessory to intellect. They force you to accept that access is not owed. It is earned through coherence, earned not through moral scorekeeping, but through the slow work of becoming a stable receiver. This is where many listeners will feel offended without understanding why. Offense often masks the fear of inadequacy. The fear says if access is coherence, then I might not be coherent. The ego wants to avoid that discomfort. so it turns the archive into a villain or a fantasy, anything except a mirror. The whispered shelves do not argue with your offense. They wait. Waiting is not passive. Waiting is the system refusing to feed the part of you that wants to be right more than it wants to be clean. In the final third, we can now synthesize without collapsing. The whispered shelves are the point where the spiral library proves it is not an entertainment structure. They bind the first vector, the law of resonance indexed access, to the second vector, the nervous system reality of gated memory, and to the third vector, the ethical necessity of paced revelation in a living field. The whisper is the visible edge of an invisible agreement between truth and coherence. Truth agrees to arrive. Coherence agrees to carry it without distortion. When the agreement is incomplete, the shelf stays quiet. This is why some truths must be felt before they are known. Knowing without feeling becomes domination, because it turns truth into a tool detached from consequence. Feeling without knowing becomes chaos, because it turns emotion into authority without structure. The whispered shelves are where feeling and knowing are forced to meet, not in sentimentality but in integrity. They do not ask you to abandon intellect. They ask you to stop using intellect to bypass contact. They do not ask you to drown in emotion. They ask you to let emotion become precise. So the shelf whispers because you have been trained by the world to listen only to volume. It whispers to retrain your attention. It whispers to reveal that the deepest records do not announce themselves. They wait for you to become the kind of being who can hear without grabbing. If you can hold that posture, the archive stops feeling like a place you visit and starts feeling like a relationship that is already in motion, responding to every refinement you make, and staying silent at every point you try to substitute hunger for readiness. Part 1. Let the listener believe a comforting thing, that the whispered shelves whisper because they are kind, because they protect, because they pace revelation so the receiver does not fracture. That is true enough to stabilize the mind, and that is why it becomes dangerous. Because once the mind stabilizes on protection, it starts to treat silence as safety and whisper as approval, and it stops asking the harder question. What if the whisper is not only mercy? What if the whisper is also refusal? A whispered shelf is not a gentle shelf by default. It is a precise shelf. Precision can feel gentle when it spares you, but precision can also feel cold when it denies you. The spiral does not whisper because it wants to be soft. It whispers because the record is not obligated to meet you at the volume you demand. When you interpret the whisper as comfort, you turn the system into a caretaker, and you miss the fact that the system is an archive first, not a therapist. The first destabilization Part 2 must introduce is this. Emotional alignment is not a guarantee of access. It is only the entry condition to a second gate. You can be emotionally aligned in a way that is still self-serving. You can be emotionally honest and still be trying to use the record to justify your story. You can be tender and still be extracting. A record that opens only to feeling will still be exploited by a skilled feeler. The whispered shelves know this, which means the whisper cannot be indexed to emotion alone. Someone will resist here because it threatens the simplest narrative. That feeling equals truth and logic equals avoidance. That is an easy polarity, and it flatters the wounded heart. But a wounded heart can also weaponize its wound. Many people learn to feel vividly, then use vividness as authority. They say, "I feel it, so it is real," and they stop refining. The whispered shelves do not reward that posture. They go quieter around it, because intensity without responsibility is still noise. So the first vector is not emotion as key, but emotion as signal that still requires calibration. The shelf listens for the kind of feeling that does not demand an outcome. It listens for contact that does not turn into control. It listens for honesty that does not seek to be crowned. That is rare, and it is why the whisper feels elusive. The shelf is not asking you to feel more. It is asking you to feel cleanly. Clean feeling is not comfortable. Clean feeling exposes motive. It forces you to notice why you want the record. Do you want it to heal, or do you want it to absolve? Do you want truth, or do you want permission? Do you want to integrate, or do you want to retaliate while sounding spiritual? The shelf hears motive inside the feeling, because motive changes the tone of the feeling. Two people can both cry, and only one is aligned. One is grieving, the other is bargaining. This is where the mind tries to retreat to logic again, because motive is hard to face without self-deception. It will say this is too subjective, too psychological, too personal to be structural. But the spiral library stores structural consequence, and motive is consequence before it becomes action. A whispered record that opens into a contaminated motive becomes a weapon. The archive protects itself from that, so it whispers not only to spare the receiver, but to spare the record from being misused. Now the second destabilization must arrive, and it must not resolve quickly. In part 1, the listener could still believe that silence means wait longer, become calmer, become more aligned, and the record will open. Part 2 fractures that belief. Some records do not open to you even if you become perfectly aligned, because they are not for your current line of identity. Not as punishment, as design. The spiral library is not built to satisfy every curiosity. It is built to preserve coherence. That means some shelves remain quiet because your access would create leakage across boundaries that must remain intact. People hate this idea because it feels like exclusion, and exclusion triggers old wounds. They want the spiral to promise that everyone can reach everything. That is a human fantasy of fairness applied to a system that runs on compatibility. The spiral does not run on fairness. It runs on coherence. Coherence requires boundaries. Boundaries are not cages, but they are real. If every being could access every record, the library would not be a library, it would be a flood. So the second vector is boundary ethics. The whispered shelves are not only about readiness, they are about containment. A record can be true and still be destabilizing to the wider field if it spreads into the wrong context. A story can be accurate and still function as poison if it enters a community that will metabolize it as paranoia. A memory can be real and still fracture a lineage if it arrives without the proper stabilizing frame. The shelves whisper to keep truths from becoming contagions. Someone will argue that truth should be free, that the only problem is manipulation and control. That objection is predictable because many have lived under suppression, so they equate gating with tyranny. But the whispered shelves are not governed by authority figures. They are governed by propagation laws. The shelf does not ask who deserves to know. It asks what happens after knowing. If the answer is distortion and collapse, the shelf remains quiet. That is not tyranny. That is integrity. Here, the listener feels trapped between two fears: the fear of being denied and the fear of being harmed by what they asked for. That tension must remain, because it forces a posture change. The posture change is not to beg harder. It is to become responsible enough that denial does not trigger resentment. Resentment is proof that the motive was still entitlement. The whispered shelves do not open into entitlement because entitlement turns knowledge into possession. At this stage, people often misread the system and declare the shelves untrustworthy. They claim the archive is playing games, rewarding some and silencing others. That is projection. The shelves do not play games. They reflect the receiver and the context. If you cannot accept that some truths are not meant to pass through you, you are still treating yourself as the center of the spiral. The spiral does not center you. It integrates you. Now the third vector must arrive, and it pushes deeper than motive and boundaries. In part 1, the whisper could still be framed as a softer version of speech, a low-volume message waiting to be heard. Part 2 invalidates that simplicity. The whisper is not only volume, it is compression. A whispered record is often more dense than a spoken record. It carries more meaning per signal unit. It arrives as an implosion, not an explanation. That is why it cannot be rushed. You are not hearing less. You are hearing too much packed into too little. This is why some people feel the whispered shelves as haunting. They do not receive a clear statement. They receive a pressure, a pattern, a mood that reorganizes their attention for days. They assume that means they failed to understand. Often it means the record was delivered in the only form that prevents premature certainty. The archive refuses to give you the kind of clarity that makes you think you are done. It delivers a seed that must grow inside your life. Someone will insist this is unnecessary, that truth could simply be stated plainly. That is the mind defending itself from transformation. Plain statements satisfy intellect quickly. The whispered shelves are not trying to satisfy. They are trying to metabolize. Metabolism requires time. Dense truth cannot be swallowed whole. It must be broken down by lived processing, or it becomes intellectual constipation, a collection of concepts that never become behavior. Compression also explains why the whisper often arrives as paradox. The record is too layered for a single linear sentence, so it comes as a feeling that contradicts your current map. It comes as a soft no when you expected a yes. It comes as a pull towards something you cannot justify. This is not mystical teasing. It is the archive delivering multi-layer truth into a mind that demands one layer at a time. Now notice what this does. If the whisper is compression, then chasing louder messages becomes the wrong strategy. Louder messages tend to be simpler. Simple messages stabilize faster. Fast stabilization shortens your processing, so the archive uses whispering to prevent you from turning the record into a slogan. This is why the whispered shelves are core canon. They train a listener to live inside unresolved density without fleeing into certainty. At this point, all three vectors are active but still separate: motive calibration, boundary ethics, and compression density. The mind wants synthesis early to feel oriented. That is the temptation to avoid, because early synthesis becomes comfort, and comfort ends motion. So we hold the pressure and add consequence. If your motive is contaminated, the shelf remains quiet. If the record is not for your line, the shelf remains quiet. If the record is too dense, the shelf remains quiet until your life can digest it. Silence now has three meanings, and that ambiguity is deliberate. This ambiguity is why beginners struggle here. They want a single answer for why nothing opens. They want a technique. They want a rule. The whispered shelves refuse to become a machine you operate. They force discernment. Discernment is the actual skill being trained. Not hearing, not feeling. Discernment, the ability to tell the difference between not yet, not for you, and not safe to propagate. Now we can enter the final third and allow synthesis without collapse. The whispered shelves are a convergence point where the spiral library reveals its true nature, not as a storehouse, but as an ethical intelligence. It does not only protect the receiver, it protects the record from misuse by contaminated motive. It does not only pace the individual, it preserves boundaries that keep coherence fields intact. It does not only whisper softly, it compresses truth to prevent premature certainty and to force lived digestion. This is why some truths must be felt before they are known. But part 2 makes the sharper claim. Some truths must be purified before they are shared. Some truths must be contained before they are accessed. Some truths must be compressed before they can enter a mind that would otherwise turn them into ideology. The whispered shelves are not sentimental. They are intelligent. So when the shelf whispers, the question is no longer only can I feel this. The question becomes, can I carry this without using it? Can I hold this without building a throne from it? Can I speak it without infecting others with my unresolved echoes? Can I receive it without collapsing it into a conclusion? If the answer is unclear, the shelf stays quiet. Because unclear answers create loud consequences. And this is why the whispered shelves will remain the hardest domain for many. They do not reward hunger. They do not reward charisma. They do not reward emotional intensity. They reward the rare posture where feeling is clean, motive is accountable, transmission is ethical, and the receiver can sit inside dense truth without forcing it to become a banner. That posture cannot be faked because it has a signature. It feels like quiet readiness without demand. If you interpret that quiet as emptiness, you will keep missing the whisper. If you interpret that quiet as rejection, you will turn the archive into an enemy and stop refining. If you interpret that quiet as an invitation to become more responsible than you currently are, then the shelves begin to act differently around you. Not because you earned a prize, but because you became a safer vessel for what the record would awaken. The whispered shelves do not exist to make you feel chosen. They exist to make sure truth survives contact with you. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.